Thank you very much for inviting me. I kind of take a view that what I'm talking about is permaculture for cities. I mean, that's probably a different way of looking at it. And in many ways, our cities have fallen victim of some of the approaches we've adopted in recent years. So I've been working on this book, Making Massive Small Change, is how do we harness the collective power of many small ideas and actions to make our towns and cities much better places. And I'm going to talk about how we did it. Before I do that, just to talk about the small print, a lot of people would jump on this and say this is a kind of a neoliberal rant to get rid of government. It's absolutely not. It's about refocusing government, making sure they focus on areas where they can deliver the fundamental conditions within which we can develop incredibly fantastic places. So I constantly, when I'm talking about it, at the back of my mind is all the time, so what do I tell government? And I've been involved in advising governments and mayors and cities and towns over many decades now. And this is my downloading of my experience about how we might see things in a slightly different way. If we use the same old thinking, we're going to get the same old results. The problem is we've taken the system we have today and then constantly try to modify it. So I often refer to it as the classic deck chairs on the Titanic. So we've added things to a system that's flawed. It's like having an underlying operating system on your computer that you're constantly doing bug fixes to, and it's not addressing the underlying issues of how you make this thing work a lot better. So even something as fundamental as sustainability has created more unsustainable development through our top-down actions. And you see this all the time in the way in which we approach things. So when we try and solve the problem of the urban poor, we make them poorer, and we look at things like spatial and social justice. The divide gets even higher. So I was involved in putting together a couple of polemics, from Massive Small Operating System for a different way of thinking, to Re-Urbanism, which was a challenge to the Urban Summit, and this other little book which I put together called The Radical Incrementalist, which was 12 stories of different people in different parts of the world, how they dealt with the whole pressure of a bottom-up change, and when they faced this top-down system of government, how they dealt with it and how they brought about something that changed. And I've incorporated that in the latest book. So I mentioned before Massive Small is the concept which is about the collective power of people. And I fundamentally believe in the creativity of people to solve urban problems. And this was kind of taken away from us about 3 generations ago when government stepped in and said, we'll take responsibility for your housing, for your education, for your health. And in many ways, they are reneging on those responsibilities now. And we're kind of relearning about how we take back power as citizens to influence the shape of places. So Margaret Mead, always a great quote, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. So this doesn't require a massive group of people. It requires people just start by starting and learn by doing. And that's very much the approach I take in many of the projects I'm working on across the world at the moment, where we're just kind of trying to relearn how we make successful places. We won't relearn them by tampering with the system. We'll relearn it by going back to understanding how we built incredible cities before and then move forward from there. So I'm going to take you through some sort of thoughts on that. The critical thing for me is how do we bring back the concept of the active citizen in our towns and cities? Not an active citizen who's responding to negatives all the time, but actually an active citizen that's engaging at the coalface to bring about change, bring about social change, physical change, environmental change, but actually doing it and allowing it to be done by governments. So we wrote this thing called the Massive Small Declaration a couple of years ago, which were kind of 10 points about how we might create a starting point. And the ambition at this point in time was to create a movement. And we went to some of the top people in the world who we respected. We didn't go to people who would just sign anything. We went to people who deliberately would agree to the principles. So people like Christopher Alexander, Nabil Hamdi, Saskia Sassen, people who had never been on the same page before all signed up to the declaration. And it's now been signed up by, I think the last time I looked, it was about 15,000 people. But it's just people who genuinely believe that this is the way we should be going. We developed a manifesto. We developed, so this instance, a pop-up manifesto. And we developed a whole lot of ideas about how we might talk about these sorts of issues to make them understood and easily understood. It couldn't be a technical exercise. It had to be something that the average person, the active citizen, the civic leader would understand. We also found that when we were looking at examples or best practice, we almost couldn't find anything in the urban planning profession that had been written in the past, I think the past 40, 50 years, that was kind of meaningful, that was still relevant to the times of today. So we found ourselves looking at the way scientists were looking at, say, the spread of Ebola, looking at complexity theory from people at the Santa Fe Institute, people looking at economics, sociology, all those sorts of things, just to understand how people were dealing with what we call complex adaptive systems, which is exactly what a town and a city is. We were able to develop some sort of structured thinking, where most difficult part is to try and tell the story in an ordered way that gives you a chance for people to read it at different levels, but still provide a structure that's easy enough for other people to take and adapt or adopt and transform over time. So let's look at this question of change. Has change happened? You know, quite often people like me, people say, well, you wish this change had happened, but I believe this change has happened already, and I'll tell you why. So right about the time of the last century, beginning of the last century, where you start to see the rise of, say, suburbia in places like Germany, and then they became formalized in about the 1940s and 1950s in the Town and Country Planning Act and all the various planning acts, New Towns Act, the Health Acts, all those sorts of things in most parts of the world. What was defined as what was normal, what was defined what was formal as well, what is the right way. It was highly centralist and it was highly reductionist. Okay, they were the two main things that defined what we did, say, post-war, in post-war reconstruction times. And sitting around at the time were these two great bits of urban theory, the modern city movement and the garden city movement. And they were quite bold things. They had very strong underlying themes. They were highly seductive. And of course, governments took that because when they were involved in rebuilding Europe or rebuilding other parts of the world, they became incredibly powerful, top-down kind of models. And what we find today is this classic conflict between this utopian idea of towns and cities versus the evolutionary approach that was in place before government took over. So what do we have today? An increasingly upside down, increasingly informal. UN Habitat predict 85% of new jobs by 2025 will be in the informal sector. The fastest growth of housing, I'm working on a project at the moment where every one formal house that's built, there's 250 shacks built in the same day. So that's the scale of change that's happening around informality. It's increasingly localist through choice, where government have said we want to become increasingly localist, or localist where people have said, let's not bother with government, we'll get on and do our own things. And of course, through this process, increasingly complex. Okay, we can't define a simple model for what a citizen is, or what a neighborhood is, or how people interact. They're incredibly complex interrelationships, and mixed with different cultures at the same time. And what you see are the two models out there that are predominant. One is the real estate model on this side, where they say a smattering of social and affordable housing, generally as a byproduct of that, and informality. Okay, and this kind of lava flowing down the hill is getting bigger and bigger all the time. And many of it not transitioning, many of it staying in informality and not being able to transition into normal pieces of town. So what we have worldwide is this permanent housing crisis. I'm sure we all experience it here. I know certainly my kids will never be able to afford a mortgage. They don't operate in that kind of world anyway. But increasingly, we're seeing this crisis, even to the extent that in one part of one borough in West London, there are 10,000 illegal beds and sheds. This is in Southall and Ealing. So informality is now hitting the old world as well. If you go to the outskirts of Paris, you go to places like Naples, things like that, you're starting to see things happening despite government rather than because of government. And this is in the most sophisticated planning system in the world, the most highly resourced planning system in the world, and the one that is also prone to enforce more than any other planning system in the world. And they can't deal with the scale of this problem. So there's the challenge for all of us, is how do we deal with things that increasingly are uncontrollable and increasingly just represent evolutionary pressures? So as we project forward, as urbanization does this, government effectiveness does that. Okay? And I think that graph crossed probably at the start of my professional career. And it's getting further and further apart. Right? We can't solve the problems of urbanization using the thinking we have and using the top-down systems we have today. They are absolutely doomed to failure. Whenever we see housing as a solution, particularly from a top-down, we see it as a numbers game. And it's not about housing. Okay? It's purely about a construction activity. And whenever we try and project something like sustainability in a top-down system, it's translated into density, and you get a place like this. I did something with the Chinese mayors recently where they said, can you tell us why we don't have any urban life here? Okay, all right. So you can actually see how policies translated, that you get incredibly good intentions leading to unintended consequences all the time. So Leopold Kohr, who I'd strongly recommend all of you in the room try and read, his Breakdown of Nations book and his book on the inner city, for me are probably the best I've read in recent years, where he has this thing about bigness. Bigness has taken over, and bigness is the single thing that shapes the cities today. So I'll give an example. In the UK, 80% of all houses built every day are done through 10 major contractors. 80% of every item of food is sold through 5 major food stores. And 80% of every banking transactions happen through 5 major banks. We have probably the most centralized, even America doesn't have it as centralized as we are here. So there's a challenge here about bigness and how we can solve things in the face of bigness. So where were we, say, pre-1900, say up to, say, 1950, urbanization or urbanism, or the development of towns and cities, was a distributed system. Everyone did it. Okay. There were no major contractors. Things happen in small numbers. They happen through partnerships between different people. And say the Victorian Times delivered housing, they delivered housing 4 times, the numbers were 4 times more than at the peak of our last housing boom. So the idea of a distributed system delivered a hell of a lot more than a centralized system, full stop. And it also, if you look at the old building acts and the old building rules, the idea that you had to source materials locally, very little was brought in from elsewhere. There might have been slate from Wales, or there might have been the fireplace from a foundry up north, or something like that. But they even had rules that bricks had to be mined within 15 miles of the site. So this idea, they had the system. It was a sustainable system. They had a craft-based system, as I think you mentioned, and it was there. It was working for all of us. And then when government came on in the 1940s, post-war, a centralized system, big government took over, armed with those 2 big movements that I mentioned earlier. And then what happened probably about 2 decades ago, governments realized that they couldn't solve the problems. So what they did is they created a mirroring of big private. So the Carillions and all those sorts of things you hear about all the time all became a mirror of big government in some form, but it was still a centralized system. So, and government liked this because it could deal with big players. It didn't have to deal with too many contractors. It could deal with the big players only. So what we're talking about is how do we achieve the benefits of both, recognizing that there are strengths in centralization, but there's sense in distribution. So we've been talking about how we could mirror these two together. So how can we model urban governance in such a way that it still worked with distributed systems? So it became a learning system, not just a centralized system, which is a command and control model. So if we look out there today, people write to me almost every week about their small change projects. I've probably got, in last year, probably 4,000 or 5,000 examples of small change where someone's looking to reclaim a street, someone's looking to create urban agriculture, someone's looking to build something or create a hub or whatever it is. There's a lot of these things, and if you go and look at them subsequently, how many of them fail, because they're generally in the realms of 1 or 2 passionate people who ultimately get eroded by the system, which throws everything at them and prevents them from doing what they do so well. And I often say to government, why would we threaten something like this? These people are effectively solving some of your deep need problems, but they can't resist. They can't resist closing people down or throwing health and safety acts against people or sending the building inspector in, whatever they do. So you're starting to see that idea of top-down killing bottom-up quite quickly. So what I'm talking about, how do we scale up that small change? How do we scale up those small change projects? What are the mechanisms we can use? And how do we create a conditioning environment within which these small change projects can happen? And I often refer to this one, sort of nabbed from a Gary Larson cartoon, was how do you harness all the little fishes to add up to something bigger than the biggest fish out there? Because technically, the big fish just eat the next fishes. That's the sort of the game that's played out there at the moment. So how do we become bigger than this? And how do we organize ourselves in such a way that enables us to represent this idea of a collective force? So here's an example of a project we did over the past couple of years, working with NASA, not NASA, the space agency, the National Architects Association, some words like that, of India, basically Southeast Asia. Third year students in their second part of third year were asked to go and work on a project in their local communities to improve public spaces as part of the whole Clean India campaign. And the challenge was put out there to them to say, you go and work with people, you come up with some ideas, and you start understanding what it's like to work for a client and understand how you might implement and how you navigate through difficult things. So the first year we had 84. That was the challenge. How do you transform? We had 84. The second year we had, I think, about 120. Last year, without us being involved at all, the students took over and they delivered 379 spaces. But they didn't just come up with the ideas, they actually implemented these projects. Okay, so they physically went in and built these projects with their communities. So this idea of scalability, having a few simple rules, and the few simple rules were engage, come up, challenge yourself, challenge the community to come up with something. It was never intended in the first year to deliver. It was intended to just expose students. It's now delivering, as I said, it delivered last year 379. Anything from someone cleaning a lake to space under a motorway, whatever it is, a broad range. And last year, when we went to the awards, 3,500 students were there. They organized the Congress and effectively have taken over this. It's now become institutionalized in the program. It's compulsory for every third year in all the Southeast Asian universities, of which there's about 200, to do a project like this. So this idea of how you can, just small changes, you can bring about massive influence and massive changes at the local level. So Jane Jacobs, probably the most quoted figure, has got this expression, cities are just problems in organized complexity. And I've always wanted to know what organized complexity looked like. So a lot of what we've been doing is to try and understand what this means. I'd read her as well. There's a very good movie out at the moment called Citizen Jane, which is worthwhile seeing. And Mike Batty, who was my mentor, think of cities not as artifacts, but as systems built more like organisms than like machines. But actually, for the past 3 generations, we've been treating cities as mechanistic models. Okay, the only tools we've got are quite mechanistic. So we can measure things like traffic flows, we can measure things, but we can't measure things like happiness or success or well-being and those sorts of things, unless we use fairly complex models. But the city likes this. The city likes these very simple tools. So what we've been trying to work on is just getting our understanding of what complexity means, what a complex system is. Because a city is a complex adaptive system. It's not a mechanistic model. It's not a robot. It's like the human body. So if you imagine years ago when they told us not to eat butter, I was surprised to see on Time magazine, June 2014, eat butter. Because as we started understanding more and more about the human body, we realized that fats break themselves into different things. And we started exposing the next level that worked against that first truth that we had, which is not to eat butter. And that's exactly what we've been doing with towns and cities. We've been using these truths that have boxed us into fairly narrow sort of corners. So if you look at a complex adaptive system, lots of individuals interacting together to share ideas and actions give rise to a number of solutions which exhibit common behaviors across all scale of the cities. Okay? And those things become the norm. They become norm, tradition, what are you going to call it? And that's what we're talking about. How do we get back to that understanding of what we think is the right way of doing things, rather than some sort of top-down utopian view of what is imposed on us? So the system, as it stands, bottom-up versus top-down, I mentioned before. But let's look at what it does. So I mentioned before the system we created. It isn't broken, it was built this way. Okay? So it doesn't mean that by just tampering with the system, we're going to solve it. We have to relook at it in some ways. So a lot of what we're talking about is how do we deliver system change? And how do we move against this idea of reductionist thinking, which has been part of our thinking since we went to junior school. Okay? We were taught to think in this reductionist way, not in this holistic, complex, adaptive system kind of way. So the way we treat cities is we constantly look at the concept of looking backwards to look forwards. Okay? When do we want it after peer review? So we'll take a policy, okay, and if we get lots and lots of evidence, we put lots and lots of evidence. And generally, I remember when I was a consultant, you weren't measured by the quality of what you said. It was measured by the thickness of the document, how much was in there. I was asked to review an informal settlement strategy for a government the other day, that the first 15 pages were acronyms. Okay? Just acronyms. Layers of, how can anyone ever understand this? How can an informal settler who would never, probably couldn't read, how would they understand this in some ways? But that's what we do. We tend to constantly layer, we tend to kind of think that evidence will get us to where we want to go. And we take this and we create another little container, whatever it is, every so often. It's layered onto the system, another fix, the last best thing. And then we pile it onto the system of state, okay, and off it sails. And it's almost impossible to turn this thing around, because that's what happens if you try to turn it around. So that's the reason why politicians don't like making change. The supertanker falls over all the time, as we experienced in the last week. So for me, the question is, do we ever understand how to move forward by looking backwards? I often say, if you drive down a dirt road, you look through the rearview mirror, you just see dust. Okay? You don't see anything. You don't see anything from the past. So the real question for us is, how do we look forward in a different way? Or more importantly, how do we manage in the present? And the planning system just constantly does this. If it ain't broke, we'll fix it until it is. That's what they tend to do. So bottom-up meets top-down. Bottom-up, you can have top-down without bottom-up. So Stalin did it quite well. I'll impose everything. You behave in this particular way. You're the model citizen. We'll impose exactly how you behave, what you do every day. But bottom-up can't do things without top-down, because bottom-up systems create their own top-down systems after a while. It's the natural process of the evolution of bottom-up activity that it creates governance systems, hierarchies. If you looked at that last diagram, I often said, hold on, there's things happening here which I thought that complex systems never had. But complex systems create their own top-down systems quite quickly, because most people want to get on and live their lives in different ways. So let's have a look at a top-down system. So government has these ideas, these tools, and these tactics, the processes, and it adds up to the system. It's a closed system because you can't engage with it. Okay? It needs parliamentary acts generally to change that system. And the control mechanism is used as a complex policies. I mentioned those boxes, set in boxes they put on tankers and sail out to sea somewhere. And they arrest development. They arrest things happening. In other words, you can only do it this way or no way. It focuses very much on fixed end states. I remember as a consultant constantly producing plans to say, tell us what it looked like in 25 years' time. You have to tell us what it looks like in 25 years' time. I knew as you lifted your pen from paper that master plan was out of date. So it's highly deterministic. We're going to follow that direction. And then the tactics they use are command and control, which are restrictive. We'll command through policy and we'll control. And that adds up to the system that can only be played by the big guys, and that leads to bigness. So the system creates bigness by its very nature. So De Hoc said, simple, clear purpose and principle give rise to complex and intelligent behavior. Complex rules and regulations give rise to simple and stupid behavior. So you can actually see why people disregard the system and say, let's get on with it anyway. I don't want to be stupid doing this. If you look at a counter version of, say, an informal settlement, this is probably the most complex example of what you see, where people are forced to build on top of one another. And it's all done by negotiation. There's no single controller here. There is no plan here. There's no planner. There's no urban designer. There's no construction advisor. Okay? It emerges through people learning and doing things and negotiation with their neighbors to do things. So there's the most complex example. So people working collectively also have ideas. They also have tools. They also have tactics. And these processes add up to what's called the way, the custom, the norm, the tradition, the mores, whatever you want to call it. And the ideas lead to simple rules which are spontaneous. That's why you quite often find reference of informal settlements being spontaneous settlements. They lead to emergent solutions which are highly adaptive, so they're constantly learning from one another. They're distributed systems generally. And then the principle around tactics is much more around self-organization, which is collaborative. And that's what I believe leads to Jane Jacobs' her statement on organized complexity. That's effectively what has happened traditionally. But if you put the two together, you might as well have a crime scene tape between the two of them. They just can't engage at all. It's just completely different language at work. It's completely different. It's Venus and Mars. It's almost impossible to reconcile how command and control meets self-organization, which is collaborative. So what we've been working on is effectively what would a top-down system look like that would facilitate more of that bottom-up. Because remember, the bottom one you don't need to teach. That's innate. Okay? We learn this quite quickly, no matter where we are. So for me, the whole question on urban society, which we write about, is really a combination of two things. It's a combination of compact urbanism, in other words, things that sit next to one another, and social capital, which is the human element of places. The goodwill, the neighborliness, the sense of community, the sense of society, all those sorts of words that add up to make places work. So for us, if you could use that social capital to build the compact urbanism, you'd have a far, far better shot at making great places and great neighborhoods. So Mumford, a couple of quotes. Civilization rests on the fact that most people do the right thing most of the time. So there's a normative story in here. We don't all go crazy. It's the things that planners fear the most, is that if we let go of the rules, the reins, people will go mad. Most of us conform. The nature of conformity, herd instincts. Philip Ball writes about when he talks about the science of society. Without cities, there's no civilization, Ed Bacon. And without neighborhoods, there's no city. Okay, Jane Jacobs again. But if you look at what the qualities of an adaptive neighborhood are, adaptability, inclusivity, diversity, familiarity, and multiplicity. Am I getting closer to the end of my time?
Yes.
Okay. I've only got 400 slides left, so.
Oh.
Okay. And I'd argue that we don't do any of these things when it comes to building neighborhoods today. In fact, we have not built a decent new neighborhood, anywhere in the world in the past 3 generations. That if you look at it compared to, say, the regeneration of an old neighborhood, a Shoreditch or parts of Brighton, I might imagine as well. We just haven't done that. So something's missing in the whole story. So I'll go through quickly. So development, like all human have we got about 5 minutes? About 5 minutes?
Okay, 4.
4, okay, all right. Okay, I'll read quickly. So simple rules, routines that provide continuity and sense of purpose. If you start looking at how that top-down system has to evolve, we have to move from complex polities to much more simple protocols that people really understand, which are generative. They generate action, they don't arrest action. We must focus much more on the starter conditions for places, in other words, put in the essential structures with which people can respond, which are highly responsive, as I said, and then you must focus on enabling behaviors. So moving away from a command and control leadership model to enabling leadership model, which is much more facilitative. And that creates a system which is far more open, and then through that, a new social contract is established between top-down and bottom-up. And if you look at these, the comparison between the two, fewer big players, many small players, much more homogeneous or zoned versus much more mixed use, much more land value driven, social purpose driven, etc., etc. And if you look across the board, you'd almost say, why would we not want that kind of world? Why would we not want something like this? And it's interesting that the focus of government is still very much on the bigness model. They still see that as the only way forward. A bit like Brexit, isn't it? Okay, so an example, self-made city. I'll end on this example because I can talk a lot more. This is an example in Berlin, which I put forward as an example of how top-down changed and facilitated more bottom-up. And what effectively happened was the mayor of Berlin was faced with a number of large sites, and he ran beauty parades for years with developers. Effectively, they procured a single developer on the basis of their great scheme, whatever the scheme was. And it took about 2 years to go through that process. They then went into planning, which took another 2 years. And then, inevitably what happened, the developer said, sorry, my scheme's not viable, I need a bit more public sector money, or alternatively, you must cut the social housing requirement, or you must sort of bend the rules slightly to make this thing work. And that happens almost all the time in every major project. Okay? Effectively, what was set out to achieve is never delivered. Okay? Or alternatively, the house builder would say, sorry, the market's changed, I can only deliver 100 houses this year, not 1,000. Okay? Which is, if you look at most of our large sites in London, they're all held to ransom in exactly that same way. So the two models that he looked at previously were the bigness model, top-down capital concentration. So the big guys with big capital came along and they took a big coarse-grained site, a mega scheme, whether it was a mall or a big housing scheme, whatever it was. And it generally was relied on, generally was involved in developing and selling. That was the sort of traditional model. So they were kind of market takers in that sense. And the other was much more a land management, bottom-up land management model, which is you're curating a neighborhood. So probably the closest example would be sort of the great estates in London, the Howard de Waldens or the Grosvenors, who take a view that we're effectively going to mature this place and over time deliver this change. And the capital will come in through small injections using people's money, not really top-down bank money. So people's own money would be levered in. And it would effectively, their role is much more a land stewardship model. Now, it's interesting, if you look at, say, Marylebone, it houses the biggest hospital in the world. Okay, if you look at Harley Street, in that area around Harley Street, its square foot in medical space is bigger than bigger by 1.5 times than the biggest hospital, but it's all in little buildings. Okay, it's still a hospital. In fact, you just walk outside. You don't walk into some sort of hospital street. You walk outside. So these guys are curating a hospital in a fine-grained way. And as technology evolves, as different people come in, they can accommodate this. It doesn't require megastructural change. It just requires stewardship or curatorship. So here's an example of the Berlin Townhouse project, which is effectively 4-story type development. And what he did, the mayor, deputy mayor, he introduced a scheme to enable people to bid on 6-meter wide plots of land. And simple rules, generally 4 to 5 stories, that was sort of or 5 to 6 stories, I think. And you could come up with whatever you wanted in that building, but he also helped with the construction method. So he was able to facilitate, through contractors, guys building the structure, which meant there was a lot of savings there. So what they were encouraged to do is to go and self-organize. So there were generally groups of people, they call them Baugruppen in Berlin, or cooperatives. And they organized themselves, they confirmed their funding, they might have had subsidies, they might have been able to get access to mortgages, whatever it is. They worked with the architect, design and agreed. They then submitted and pitched to a panel that the mayor had put together. And the metrics were generally, what does this building contribute to community, not its pure value. They measured the success of it in different ways. And then they awarded and started. The shortest time it took from the first to the end was 6 weeks. So 4 years versus 6 weeks. So that's the first sort of clue in this whole thing. The headlines were, they delivered housing 40% less, cost-wise, less, on the same land values as London. So everyone said, that's Berlin, it's different. But if you compared it with land values in London, the construction costs, because they took out developer profit, they took out structural costs, the time and speed meant that they were delivering that same unit that a developer might have delivered for 40% less. More importantly, 4 times quicker. And the attractive thing for the deputy mayor was, he was revenue-based. He wanted rates and taxes paid quickly. So the quicker he had this, and if he's 4 to 4 weeks, he recognized that he had, 23 months quicker, or 22 months quicker to get rates and taxes in. And more importantly, they had much higher space standards. People were building to their own needs. They weren't building to sort of minimum standards. They had much higher social outcomes because he developed social capital from day one. Much higher urban quality. But more importantly, they created double the land value. So when someone like Savills recently valued it, they valued it as double the value that a developer-led process would achieve. So for a person investing in it, it was quite a good move. Now the developers in Berlin are using this model. So I'll stop there. Okay. All right, I can carry on, but...
I think we need to take a break.
Okay.
That was a really nice example to end on. It's a real inspirational example about what you were talking about put into practice, really.
Good.
So,
Okay.